Okay, so let's think about this. What happens when a young nation, right after a revolution, just suddenly booms in size, pushing outwards, testing its own limits? That's really the big question we're digging into today on the deep dive. We've got this great stack of sources here looking at the early American Republic, specifically that really intense period between 1754 and 1800, our goal. To pull out the absolute key insights from these sources about migration, conflict, and, well, the incredibly complex story of slavery's expansion back then. Think of it as your shortcut to getting a real handle on this pivotal time.
It absolutely is pivotal. This period, it really does set the stage for so much later American history. You've got this massive westward push, intense competition for land, alliances constantly shifting. And right alongside that, you see these regional attitudes towards slavery starting to really harden you. It's all interconnected, a really dynamic interplay. Understanding that is, well, it's crucial.
The Restless Republic, westward expansion, and indigenous resistance.
Let's kick off with some numbers because they're frankly staggering. The U.S. population, it almost doubled between 1776 and 1800. Like 2.5 million to nearly 5 million. That's almost 100% growth every 25 years. So with that kind of explosive growth, what did that relentless push west actually mean? For the land, obviously, but especially for the people already living there.
Well, that huge population increase plus this really powerful idea of owning your own land, it just fueled this constant westward drive. And inevitably, that meant intense competition, conflict over land, over resources. Primarily with American Indian groups, it was, well, collision course.
Right. So given that constant pressure, how did the American Indian groups respond? I mean, they weren't just passive bystanders. What were their strategies?
Oh, absolutely not passive. You see really sophisticated adaptive strategies. Different groups were constantly evaluating their alliances, with the Europeans, other tribes, sometimes even the new United States. Their main goal, consistently, was trying to limit that white settler migration, trying to keep control of their lands and resources. And it's important to remember, even after the French lost the Seven Years' War, the indigenous peoples in places like the Ohio Valley, they fundamentally believed that land was theirs. That belief led to major conflicts like Pontiac's Rebellion, which was this widespread uprising against British policies right after the war. It showed real unified resistance.
That's a great point. And it wasn't just the settlers and the tribes, was it? The British and Spanish were still involved on the frontier, even after the Revolution.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Can't forget the international angle. The British and Spanish kept making alliances with American Indian groups. They provided weapons, sometimes actively encouraged attacks on American settlements.
Which must have just cranked up the tension with the U.S.
Exactly. And, people often underestimate the Western Confederacy, this alliance of Native American tribes. They were actually very effective for a while, limiting settlement right up until 1794. They won significant victories against U.S. forces.
But 1794, that brings us to a turning point, right? The Battle of Fallen Timbers. That seems like a major blow to the Confederacy. What happened?
Fallen Timbers was a decisive defeat for the Confederacy, yeah. And there's this really telling detail. The British, who had posts nearby, actually refused to give shelter to the retreating Native Americans.
Wow.
They wanted to avoid war with the U.S., so they essentially abandoned their allies at a critical moment. And the U.S. Army, under General Anthony Wayne, used this brutal scorched earth tactic. They burned huge amounts of cornfields, the food source for these tribes. It was devastating. It ultimately forced the signing of the Treaty of Greenville.
And that led to removal from Ohio.
Yes, huge land cessions in the Ohio area. It's a tactic, that scorched earth policy, that Washington himself had ordered against the Iroquois during the Revolution when they sided with the British. So it wasn't new, but incredibly effective and brutal.
Chilling. So how did all this fighting and, well, these treaties change how the U.S. federal government dealt with Native Americans? Were there big policy shifts?
There were. You see the federal government trying to assert control. The Indian Intercourse Act of 1790 is key here. It basically said the federal government, not individual states, would handle all dealings with Native Americans in the West.
Okay, trying to centralize things.
Right. But here's the pattern. Whenever conflict actually broke out between settlers pushing west and native tribes, the federal government pretty much always sided with the settlers, which is a huge shift from earlier British policy, ironically. The British had tried to limit westward movement specifically to avoid these kinds of wars.
Huh. But wasn't there also some language, like in the Constitution, that recognized Native American sovereignty? It sounds contradictory.
It is deeply contradictory. You have the Commerce Clause from 1788, which explicitly states that tribes signing treaties were sovereign, independent nations. So, on paper, sovereignty is recognized.
But in practice,
In practice, it gets undermined almost immediately. Take the Treaty of Hopewell with the Chickasaw. It set boundaries, peaceful relations. But other tribes didn't recognize it, and the U.S. government found it, well, convenient to make changes later or just ignore parts of it. It set a really damaging precedent for how treaties would be treated down the line.
on the edge frontier, life, and emerging identities.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit from the battles to the people, the cultures emerging on this expanding frontier. By 1800, maybe 20% of Americans lived out there. What was life like? What kind of unique cultures developed? And what tensions came with them?
Yeah, it's fascinating. This is where some real American legends are born, right? You get figures like Daniel Boone exploring Kentucky, using the Cumberland Gap, which itself was an old Native American route, it's important to note, or someone like John Chapman, Johnny Appleseed, this sort of eccentric folk hero planting orchards across the frontier. These figures became symbols of that westward spirit.
But not everyone was a folk hero. You also hear terms like squatters or crackers. Those sound less than complimentary. Who were they?
Right, those were often derogatory terms. They referred to migrants who didn't own land, often because they were too poor. They'd just find unclaimed land, squat, and build a cabin. Lived off the grid, essentially.
And they had this kind of double image.
Exactly. A real double identity. Sometimes praised as rugged backwoodsmen, independent, close to nature, embodying these older virtues, but other times condemned as white savages, crude, violent, living in squalor. Nancy Eisenberg's book, White Trash, does a great job tracing this. They become this powerful political idea seen as distrustful of civilization, but fiercely loving liberty. And importantly, many couldn't vote, so they felt outside the system.
Which sets the stage for later political shifts.
Definitely. You see the echoes leading right up to someone like Andrew Jackson.
But these frontier tensions weren't just about image, they could turn violent. Groups like the Paxton Boys, for instance.
Yeah, the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania are a stark example of the uglier side. They were basically a white supremacist vigilante group. They carried out horrific massacres of innocent American Indians. It just underscores the raw, often racialized conflict over land and culture simmering out there.
So with all this chaos, mass migration, violence, people squatting on land, how did the young federal government cope? Could they even manage it or protect people?
Honestly, they struggled big time. The government desperately needed money from selling Western land to pay off war debts, huge debts.
Right.
But they didn't really have a strong army to protect settlers or enforce treaties or regulate the flow of people. It was just beyond their capacity at that point.
So much so that some people just decided to go their own way.
Precisely. Look at the state of Franklin. After the Revolution, 4 counties in what's now Tennessee just declared themselves an independent state for a while. They felt the government back eased, the elite didn't understand them, didn't care about their needs. It really shows how fragile that national unity was, especially on the edges.
A nation divided the deepening chasm of slavery.
Okay, so while all this is happening out west, the expansion, the frontier cultures, the conflicts, there's this other huge defining issue gaining force: slavery. And the beginnings of anti-slavery sentiment, too. How did this start to really divide the country along regional lines?
Yeah, this is where the national narrative gets incredibly complicated and, frankly, tragic. Some of the earliest, most vocal opponents of slavery were religious groups. The Quakers, the Mennonites, their opposition was fundamental to their faith. They really laid some of the moral groundwork for abolitionism later on.
And there was an attempt early on to get the federal government involved, right? That 1790 anti-slavery petition.
That's right. Benjamin Franklin, actually, and the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, they put forward this petition. They argued, look, the country is young, let's deal with this now before it gets even more deeply rooted.
Makes sense. So what happened?
Well, Congress debated it, but they ultimately decided that the Constitution prevented them from banning the international slave trade before 1807. And they sort of interpreted that to mean they couldn't really touch slavery at all until then. So the petition failed.
They kicked the can down the road.
Essentially, yes, a huge missed opportunity. And at the same time, you see northern states, especially New England, starting to pass emancipation laws. So the number of free Black people there starts growing significantly compared to the South and the future West. The divergence begins.
A real what-if moment. But resistance wasn't just petitions. Enslaved people themselves fought for freedom. Gabriel's rebellion in 1800 sounds incredibly significant.
Oh, it was hugely significant.
Yeah.
Led by Gabriel Prosser, who was an enslaved blacksmith in Virginia, he planned this large-scale uprising. The goal was to march on Richmond, capture weapons, and demand an end to slavery.
What was his inspiration?
He was definitely inspired by the American Revolution's ideals of liberty, but also by the successful slave revolt in Haiti. And his vision was remarkable. He apparently hoped to build an alliance that included not just enslaved people, but also poor white workers. Equality was part of his vision.
Like amazing. What went wrong?
A massive rainstorm hit on the night it was supposed to happen, causing a delay. And during that delay, 2 enslaved men revealed the plot to the authorities, likely under duress. Many conspirators were rounded up. Gabriel himself and about 25 others were executed, and the backlash was severe. Virginia passed even harsher laws restricting enslaved and free black people. A tragic outcome.
So even as you have these acts of resistance and some anti-slavery moves in the North, the institution of slavery itself was actually expanding. How did that happen? Was there a specific trigger?
There was a major technological trigger. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, invented in 1793.
Ah, the cotton gin. We learned about it in school, but maybe not as full impact.
Its impact was profound and devastating. Before the gin, separating cotton fibers from the seeds was incredibly slow, painstaking work. The gin mechanized it, made it exponentially faster. Suddenly, growing short-staple cotton, which could thrive across vast areas of the South, became incredibly profitable.
Okay, so more profit means...
More profit means a massive expansion of cotton plantations. And cotton plantations required huge amounts of labor, enslaved labor.
So the gin directly fueled the demand for enslaved people.
Directly and dramatically. The demand skyrocketed in the Deep South. And where did enslavers get more people? They looked north. You see this massive forced migration, sometimes called the Second Middle Passage. Hundreds of thousands, estimates range from 500,000 to maybe 1 million enslaved people were sold from upper South states like Virginia and Maryland down to the expanding cotton regions, families torn apart. Plus, cotton farming exhausts the soil quickly, so planters were constantly seeking new land further west, taking enslaved people with them, pushing slavery into new territories.
So the gin didn't just make slavery more profitable, it physically spread it across the continent.
Absolutely. It entrenched it, expanded it, and made the South economically dependent on it in a way that laid the groundwork, undeniably, for the Civil War decades later.
And just quickly, the legal importation of enslaved people from Africa, that was still happening during this period too.
Yes, that's the other piece. The Constitution allowed the international slave trade to continue until 1807. Congress did ban it effective January 1st, 1808, but in those last 2 decades, between 1787 and 1808, the rate of importation surged. Something like 200,000 enslaved Africans were brought into the U.S. just in that short window.
Unbelievable. Half as many as in the previous 180 years brought in just 20 years.
A final terrible rush before the legal door closed on the transatlantic trade, though, of course, the internal trade continued horrifically. Outro.
Okay, so pulling this all together, we've covered a lot. This relentless westward migration, the birth of these unique, often conflicted frontier cultures, and this deepening tragic divide over slavery's expansion, even as early anti-slavery voices emerged. It's quite a picture.
It really is. And I think it's crucial to remember that this founding period, which we often idealize, was shot through with intense conflict. Conflict over land, conflict over identity, conflict over basic human rights. The foundations being laid weren't just for a new nation, but also for some of its deepest, most enduring struggles. It shows just how contested and uncertain everything really was.
Definitely. So thinking about that rapid growth, the sheer difficulty of governing this huge, diverse, expanding territory, what questions or maybe compromises from back then do you feel are still echoing today? What unresolved issues from that time still resonate in American society? Something for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. What does this deep dive make you want to learn more about?